I went camping with three of my buddies, John, Bennett, and Kyle. We do this every year, kind of a bro trip to reconnect with each other. We were all fresh out of college and decided to go on our yearly camping trip in August. We are from Oregon and ended up camping in the woods there, like we usually do at the same spot. The first day was great. We set up our spot, explored the area, and by the time the sun was setting, we set up a campfire and made dinner. After a few too many beers and some s'mores, we decided to go to sleep. It was a perfect end to a perfect day. Our second day was basically the same thing: hiking, food, one too many beers. But this night ended up being not so perfect. I remember watching a Mr. Nightmare video about some guys camping, and they heard laughing, and it turned out it was nobody in their group. Yeah, my story is similar. As we finished the rest of the beers, we were wrestling around with each other like guys do. Then John stopped messing around and froze. Everyone was confused, but John claimed he heard something nearby. I told him it was most likely a squirrel, and he said, no, it was most definitely not. He was scaring me at this point, so I decided to resume the tackling session, and I took him down. We forgot about the whole thing until about 10 minutes later. We were tired from wrestling and joking around, so we decided to put out the fire and head into the tent. We had a 6-person tent for anybody wondering, so we were all in one tent. Just as our only light source besides our flashlights went out, I heard a slight cackle. I assumed it was one of the boys because we were all clearly a bit buzzed, so everything is funny. I wanted to see what was so funny, so I turned the flashlight directly onto Bennett's face. I thought he was the one laughing. Bennett's face was as white as a ghost. He looked at me and said, "Did you guys hear that?" I said, "The laughing?" And Kyle said, "That wasn't you?" We were all shaken and decided to go into the tent. As we got into the tent, I pulled out an axe that I used to cut the wood. It was the only source of protection we had. I was on the very end of the tent, with Kyle and John in the middle and Bennett on the other end. We were all silent, but I knew we were all wide awake after hearing the laughing. We weren't exactly at an actual campsite where there were other people around. We just walked into the woods, found an open spot, and set up camp there. We were about a mile from our car, with barely any cell signal, so I guess you could say we weren't exactly in the safest position if there was a crazy maniac running around. I got tired, so I dozed off. I have no idea how long I was sleeping before I heard laughing again. It's hard to describe, other than it sounded menacing. I was frozen. I didn't move. I didn't even try to look over to see if my buddies were awake. The axe was under my pillow. As I mustered up the strength to move and get the axe, I saw what looked like someone's finger pressed up against the tent, just circling around the tent. Someone was definitely outside, walking around our tent, laughing. When they got to the front part of the tent where the entrance was, they stopped. About 5 seconds went by before the person ferociously shook the tent and screamed, "Boogity! Boogity!" That's when I knew my buddies were awake as well, because Kyle screamed like a little girl, and after he screamed, whoever was behind the tent laughed again and walked off. We laid there the rest of the night, wide awake and definitely sober. We didn't want to move out of pure fear that whoever was out there was still there. When the sun came up, we packed up everything and walked back to our car. We still go camping every year. but make sure to go to an actual camping site. I now bring a judge gun with me, and not just an axe. Whoever was outside our campsite could have been a deranged homeless person, psychopath serial killer, meth head, or just an asshole playing a prank on us. But I sure as hell won't camp in a rural place anymore. Stay safe out there. It's a dangerous world we live in.
Let me start off with a little bit of background information. I am a 14-year-old Canadian male, and this happened around a year ago. This story is nothing but the truth. My grandparents and I are extremely close and have been all of my life. So, my grandfather, an outdoorsy, get-off-your-phone kind of guy, pitched the idea to go camping in early August 2017. I was kind of excited because I don't get outside as often as I should, and I figured it would be some quality time with him. That being said, we weren't going true camping. He wanted to go into the woods, but I told him about a nearby campground we could go to. He was still thrilled, so we embarked on our weekend journey. Let me paint you a picture. Our campsite was a dead end, aside from the one next to ours. It was right near the lake. It was beautiful, but to our dismay, we had people right beside us. We did all the camping things, made a fire, went swimming, and even the infamous spooky stories around the campfire. We hit the sack at about 10 o'clock p.m. because there was not much else to do. As soon as my head hit the pillow, it started. The crunching of leaves on our campsite. We thought nothing of it at the time, because the night was still young. Some assholes were setting off fireworks, and others were having a raging party. Hell, even our neighbors were still laughing. I fell asleep for a while. 11 o'clock p.m. is when it started to get weird. The party was still on, but our neighbors shut up, so the crunching of leaves didn't make any sense. It was consistent, so my guess is the noise was footsteps. No one needed to be on our campsite, so falling asleep was a bigger challenge. My grandpa seemed to be having an even harder time, as he seemed to be on alert mode. Yes, I know we are both paranoid, but I feel like that paranoia keeps us safe. I wake up and check my watch. It's 12 o'clock a.m. It starts to rain. The water is splashing against the rocks, and the thunder in the distance is quiet enough to sleep with. Even over the sound of rain pattering against our tarp, I still hear the footsteps. The unsettling nature of the situation starts to eat away at me. I wasn't scared. I was just creeped out. Sleep overcame me, but it didn't come easily. My grandpa finally slept, too. A crack of thunder woke me up again. Full-blown thunderstorm now. I felt relieved as I thought the footsteps stopped, until I heard the thump of wood. I don't know what the person did, but I heard two very loud knocks, followed by 2 large splashes. Screw this was my only thought as the footsteps continued around our campsite. I stayed still for 2 hours. 5 o'clock a.m. Daybreak was near, but my heart nearly exploded when I heard somebody fumbling around with the tent zipper and the fabric. I see the outline of 3 fingers being dragged across the tent. My body shut down as they came closer and closer and stopped when the fabric brushed against my head. Every nerve in my body told me to scream, but I didn't. The hand trailed away and became quieter as they left our campsite. I woke my grandfather as soon as the sun came up. Before we left, I went to investigate our site. Lots of the ground was turned into mud during the storm, so the massive boot prints were easily noticeable. Easy to say, we dipped the fuck out after that. And that was it. Nothing ever became of it, aside from a story I can share. My grandpa and I don't really talk about it, but if anything, it brought us closer together. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are very poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there is a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the forest service roads. There are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along them. Some of the people you will see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the forest service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck lights running, and we set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. I guess none of us thought that it was weird someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 o'clock. As we are eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles did not make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go over and investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we had all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decides to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All of the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we were almost at the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we don't need to see what the light was after all. We walk back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we got a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing earlier. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering in the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up to the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're all locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it was not Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up our truck and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and started to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us have sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward very slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It might have just been balanced on the top, and we drive over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects the light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the forest service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer. It stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way, just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though.